Hey everybody, it's me, Ben, back again for Chapter 6, Decision Making and Creativity. I'll try and keep it shorter than I did last time. I've got some constructive criticism on my long-windedness, and hopefully I will eliminate that this time for you guys. So sit back, relax, take some notes, and enjoy. Today's learning objectives are to describe the rational choice paradigm, and to explain why people differ from the rational choice paradigm when identifying problems and opportunities, evaluating and choosing alternatives, and finally evaluating decision outcomes. We're also going to discuss the roles of emotions and intuition in the decision-making process. Furthermore, we're going to describe the benefits of employee involvement and identify the 4 contingencies that affect the optimal level of employee involvement. And finally, we're going to wrap up by describing employee characteristics, workplace conditions, and specific activities that support creativity. First off, we've got the rational choice paradigm, also what I'm going to refer to as the RCP for short. Defined, the RCP is the view and decision making that people should, and typically do, use logic and all available information to choose the alternative with the highest value. The ultimate goal in using the RCP is to choose the alternative with the highest subjective expected utility. And the subjective expected utility is the probability of satisfaction from the choice that is made, and the goal is that we want to have the highest probability of satisfaction possible. The decision-making process has 6 steps. 1 through 6 are being to identify the problem or opportunity, then to choose the best decision process needed. Next, we're going to develop alternative solutions, and from that, we're going to choose the best alternative. Moving forward, we're going to implement the selective alternative, and then finally, we're going to wrap it up by evaluating the decision outcome. A few problems do exist with the RCP, the main one being that it's incredibly logical yet relatively impossible to apply in reality. The model makes a couple assumptions, the first being that people are efficient and logical at all times. This just isn't true. People suffer from the inability to recognize all problems within a situation, and we also fail to recognize when our possible solutions or alternatives fail. The RCP also assumes that logic prevails and emotions have no influence. This is also untrue, as many times emotions heavily influence and can even dominate the decision-making process. Alright, we're going to first start by looking at when we deviate from the RCP. The first situation where we deviate from the RCP is when we're trying to identify problems and opportunities. And this happens because as humans we form biases that restrict our perspective. The first bias we form is called stakeholder framing, and this is where organizational decisions and actions are influenced mainly by what attracts management's attention rather than by objective reality of the external and internal environments. The second is called mental models, and these are models our mind create that fill in the blanks of reality. They blind us from seeing unique problems or opportunities because those problems or opportunities may produce negative evaluations that are dissimilar to the mental model, and we don't like that. The third bias is called the decisive leadership bias, and this is the tendency of people to decide that decisive leaders are good leaders. These people form quick opinions that everyone goes along with simply because these people come up as competent, confident, and they're the only ones coming up with something, so people just run with it, and in the process they fail to recognize deficiencies in their logic or fallacies in their opinions, etc. Fourth, we have the solution-focused problem bias. And this is when you define problems as veiled solutions. Typically, they are vague and they fail to describe an actual problem. It's kind of generalized things, kind of saying, hey, we don't have the right amount of control over our supply chains. Okay, that's fantastic, but that doesn't actually help us. That just begs the question. And fifth, we have something called perceptual defense. And this is when we block out bad news. And it's as simple as that. We just don't want to hear it. Next, we deviate from the RCP when we're evaluating and choosing alternatives. And this is caused mainly by bounded rationality, and this is the view that people are bounded in their decision-making capabilities, including access to limited information processing, and a tendency towards satisficing rather than maximizing when making choices. Bounded rationality is affected and is typically a result of having ambiguous goals, limited information process capabilities, settling for satisfactory, not maximization as the RCP assumes that we do, and we end up choosing one opportunity as a solution instead of developing alternatives. So you find one solution, and that's the only one that will do. That's just kind of how human nature works. It's not in our nature to find a solution and then step back and be like, well, wait, what could we do differently and potentially do better? Next is the emotional influence that comes into play, and that sounds pretty self-explanatory, but we have a few factors that need to be touched on. The first is the formation of early preferences, and this is when our brain quickly attaches specific emotions to information about each alternative, and our preferred alternative is strongly influenced by those initial emotional markers. So you kind of latch on to something, kind of like your first girlfriend or boyfriend, whatever. You had a great time. It's kind of hard to let go. Next, you have the changing in the decision evaluation process itself, and this can be really detrimental because you find yourself, if you're in a bad mood, it can really affect your ability to make good decisions, and good mood as well. If you're in a bad mood, you can find yourself being more nitpicky, more critical, picking at the details, and just all around, being negative, even if the solution might be a really good one. On the other hand, you could be overly optimistic. You could be in a great mood and, just overlooking the small details that really might play effect and just being like, hey, well, this seems like a good idea, so let's go with it. And finally, you have emotions that serve as information when we evaluate alternatives. And this process is similar to having a temporary improvement in emotional intelligence. Most emotional experiences remain below the level of conscious awareness, but people actively try to be more sensitive to these subtle emotions when making a decision. So let's say, for an example, that the book provides is when you buy a car, you not only logically evaluate the features of the car, you also try to gauge your emotions when visualizing what it would be like to own the car. So your emotions are coming into effect when, buying the car really should be about, gas mileage and, dependability and safety. And you're just like, oh, well, I like the color red. That's not necessarily a good way to make a decision, but it happens as a result of human nature. And finally, we, deviate from the RCP when we're trying to evaluate decision outcomes. And this comes from what's called the confirmation bias. And this is unwittingly selectivity in the acquisition and use of evidence. And it occurs when, upon evaluating decisions, us as individuals will ignore or downplay the negative features of the selected alternative and overemphasize its positive features. And this has a lot to do with what's called the escalation of commitment. And that is, simply put, repeating an apparently bad decision or allocating more resources to a failing course of action. And there's four main influences that go into the escalation of commitment. The first being self-justification. This is when you maintain a course of action when the need to justify a decision is high, and this occurs typically when people identify to a course of action personally. It's not really so much about business or whatnot, it's about a personal course of action. The next influence is called the prospect theory effect. And this is when people are willing to take more risks to avoid losses than to increase gains. You'll see this a lot when, for example, if you lost $50, you'd feel worse about losing the $50 than if somebody gave you $50. The negative emotions typically outweigh the positive ones. Next, you have what's called perceptual blinders. And this is the inability of people to see problems quickly enough to do something to right the wrong. It's like trying to stop a freight train. Once it picks up enough speed and it's got enough momentum going, it becomes very, very tough to stop, and you have a very small window of opportunity in which to correct the wrongs that are occurring. And finally, you have closing cost, and this is an actual tangible influence, you could say, because persisting. You find people persisting because there's a possibility or certainty that they may experience high cost or loss at the end of a project, and because if you stop a project, then pretty much whatever you've done up to that point is more than likely going to go down as a loss, whether it be financially or how your boss perceives your ability to get things done. You have a decline in social perception, and even personal political cost as well. So yeah, that's when people deviate from the RCP. Next, we're going to look at employee involvement and how it can benefit organizations in the decision-making process. So employee involvement is the degree to which employees influence how their work is organized and carried out. Potential benefits are better problem identification, more choices being generated, and is in conjunction with better choices being generated. Third, you're going to more likely select the best alternative. And finally, you're going to see stronger commitment to the decision by the employees. Now, success of employee involvement is contingent on a few factors. The first being the decision structure. The decision must involve a novel or complex problem or opportunity for the benefit of employee involvement to increase. If you have program decisions, those are less likely going to benefit from employee involvement because they've been in place for a long time and they work the same way every time. The second contingency is a source of decision knowledge. And this comes into play when leaders lack sufficient knowledge to determine the optimum solution, and involving employees is the best way to gain that information. The third contingency is decision commitment. And if you involve employees in the decision-making process, you'll see an increased commitment to its success. The employees will work harder because they feel as though they're working for their goals and their ideas, as opposed to just fulfilling the ideas and motives of their superiors. And finally, you're looking at risk of conflict, and this is where managers must evaluate if involving employees is the best course of action, because they must assess whether employee goals conflict with organizational goals and whether or not employees will agree on the preferred solution. So if you meet those two and you have a situation where employee goals don't conflict with organizational goals, and you have employees that can come to some common ground, then you avoid the risk of conflict, and employee involvement is a good course of action. We're going to end today's presentation talking about things that support creativity. The first factor in having a creative organization is having creative employees, and creative employees typically demonstrate characteristics such as cognitive and practical intelligence, and this is having employees who are above average in intelligence and their ability to process information, analyze ideas, and apply their own ideas. Practical intelligence is really the ability to evaluate potential usefulness of their individual ideas. These employees are also persistent. They have a higher need to achieve, strongly motivated, and typically demonstrate moderate or high levels of self-esteem. Moving on, you have these employees have subject knowledge and experience. You can't be creative if you don't know anything about what you're working on. The theory that you need knowledge to discover new knowledge. And finally, you need employees who have an independent imagination. And these are people who are highly open to new experiences, They have a moderately low need for affiliation and possess strong values around self-direction and stimulation. So, you know, you have people who like to do fun and new things, who don't need to be a part of a crowd, who are independent and who know where they're going and feel good about what they're doing. Next, moving on, you need certain organizational conditions to be fulfilled in order to possess high levels of creativity. First and foremost, you need a learning orientation culture. And this is where mistakes are okay. They happen. You let them happen. You learn from them, and you move on. It's critical. It's a very crucial part of being creative in an organization. You can't be creative if you don't mess up at least once. Next is you have task significance and autonomy, and this is where employees have the freedom to pursue novel ideas without bureaucratic delay getting in the way, and feeling that what they're doing benefits a larger audience. Next, you have communication and resources. This is pretty self-explanatory. I don't really need to go into much detail. You need to have open communication lines, and you need to have sufficient resources for people to be creative. Next, you have security and mutual support. Personally, I think this is the most important one because being creative is risky in a lot of jobs. A lot of people don't like creativity, and you need assurance that being creative won't result in a loss of employment. And this can, be aided significantly by having support from not only your superiors but your coworkers. If you feel like people are on your side, then you're not going to be afraid to, step outside the box every now and then. Next, you have unique in work environments. Well, I thought security and mutual support were the most crucial. I think this one is the coolest. And this is where you find employers that spice things up a little bit. They offer unique buildings or office layouts, and these things by nature tend to promote creativity. Instead of having gray cubicles and gray floors and gray ceilings and gray walls, you have some red and some ping pong tables and standing desk and all that stuff, and I think that's really cool. I would love to work at a place like that. But anywho, moving on, there are specific activities in which people can engage in that deal directly with being creative, and these start out with you can redefine the problem as an organization. Managers can implement this activity, and it's pretty much just revisiting old projects from a different perspective. 6 months down the line, you're not going to be thinking the same way you were before about a certain project. You can bring in people who are unfamiliar with the project for their thoughts and opinions. It's a really great practice. You get some outside perspective, especially if you've been working on it for a long time. It's really, really tough to remove yourself from a situation or a project and think about it as though you know nothing. Next up, you have associative play, and this can have nothing to do with work. I love this, and it's art classes or impromptu storytelling, acting, interpretive dance, etc. It's just activities that directly stimulate creativity through completely independent means. It's just about being creative. It's not really worried about work per se. From that, you have morphological analysis, which is the practice of listing different dimensions of a system and the elements of each dimension, and then looking at each combination. This leads to careful examination, and that sounds really complicated, but in essence, it's just looking at something as a whole, breaking it down, examining it, and thinking about how each thing works independently. And finally, you've got cross-pollination, which is pretty much what we do in school. I feel like it's where you have people from different areas of the organization, the class, etc., that exchange ideas. Brainstorming. And it's people working on the same problem from a different perspective. And this highlights the fact that creativity rarely occurs alone. And this is what I took away from this chapter, is that teamwork is the most crucial element, not only to creativity, but to effective decision making. You get the optimum decisions, you get the most effective decisions, you get the most creative decisions when you work as a team. So yeah, there's my presentation.